After saving the starving Apache POW woman, the cowboy said, "You're under my protection now." The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the rugged desert. The wind whispered over the sand and rocks, carrying the dry, sharp scent of the earth. Luke, a cowboy who had spent most of his life roaming the frontier, guided his horse along the winding trail. He was a tall, sturdy man, his face weathered by years under the unforgiving sun. His hands were strong from handling ropes, reins, and the hard work of the ranch, but his eyes, though rough, held a quiet attentiveness. He had learned to notice the small signs in the wilderness: broken twigs, fresh tracks, faint traces of smoke. Every detail could mean life or death in a land so wild and unpredictable. That afternoon, Luke rode through a narrow canyon, flanked by jagged rocks that rose like ancient sentinels. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft sound of his horse's hooves on the dusty ground. He was used to solitude. It was part of the life he had chosen. But something about the stillness of the canyon felt different that day. It was not just quiet. It was too quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. As he rounded a bend, a flash of movement caught his eye. At first he thought it was a rock tumbling down the slope, but then he saw a small figure lying near the riverbank. Luke slowed his horse and squinted against the sun, trying to make sense of the scene. The figure was curled on the ground, motionless and covered in dust. Something in him stirred, a mix of concern and caution. In his years on the frontier, he had learned to expect the unexpected. Strangers could be friends or foes, and a lone person in the desert was often a sign of trouble. He guided his horse closer, moving slowly, his eyes scanning for danger. When he was within a few yards, he saw that it was a woman. She was young, though it was hard to tell how young exactly. Her body frail and wasted from hunger. Her hair was matted and dusty, her clothing torn and hanging loosely from her thin frame. Her hands were scratched and bruised, and faint marks on her wrists suggested she had been restrained at some point. The sight of her made Luke's heart tighten, even though he was a man who had seen suffering before. There was something in her eyes that spoke of fear, exhaustion, and a deep sadness. Luke dismounted and approached her carefully. He didn't want to startle her, knowing that someone in such a state could panic. He spoke softly, his voice calm and steady.
"Hey there. You okay?" he asked, keeping his distance.
The woman flinched at the sound, turning her face away, but she did not flee. Her body was too weak to move much, and the desert had drained the strength from her. Luke crouched down, placing his hands on his knees as he looked at her. He reached slowly into his bag and pulled out a canteen of water and a piece of jerky he had carried for himself. He held them out, careful not to make sudden movements. "Drink some water. Eat a little," he said gently. "It'll help." At first, she stared at him with wide, wary eyes, hesitant to accept his offer. Every movement of his hand seemed to her like a potential threat. He could see the memories of past hardships etched into her face, the fear of betrayal and cruelty that lingered even now. But hunger and thirst were stronger than fear. She slowly reached out, trembling, and took a sip of water. Then, with even greater effort, she accepted the small piece of jerky. Her hands shook, but she ate, and Luke could see her body relax just slightly as the food and water began to soothe her aching hunger and thirst. Luke knew he had to act quickly. The desert could be cruel, and the woman was in no condition to travel far on her own. He gently laid his coat over her shoulders, shielding her from the scorching sun. "You're safe for now," he said quietly, though he knew that saying it was not enough. He would have to prove it with his actions. Slowly, he guided her to a shaded spot under a large rock overhang. The shade offered some relief from the heat, and he set down his pack so he could tend to her more carefully. He tore a piece of cloth from his spare bandages and cleaned a shallow cut on her arm, doing his best to avoid causing her pain. She flinched when he touched the wound, but she did not pull away. There was a flicker of trust forming, fragile, but real. Once she was somewhat comfortable, Luke settled down a few feet away. He kept his hand near his knife ready for any danger, but he also wanted her to know that he was not a threat. "My name's Luke," he said softly. "I'm just trying to help. You don't have to be afraid of me." The woman remained silent, her dark eyes watching him carefully. Slowly, she whispered her name. It was short, sharp, and musical. Aita. Luke repeated it to himself, trying to remember. Aita. Okay, he said. I'm glad you told me. Through small gestures and quiet patience, Luke began to learn her story. She had been captured during a conflict between settlers and her people, taken away from her home, and left in the desert without food or water. Her voice was faint, but her words carried the weight of hardship and loss. Luke listened without judgment. He didn't need to ask why such cruelty had happened. He had seen too much of it in his life. What mattered now was keeping her alive. As the hours passed, the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. The desert grew cooler, but the shadows stretched long and ominous. Luke built a small fire, careful not to let it flare too high, and placed some water nearby to keep it warm. Aita watched from under the blanket, her body slowly recovering strength, though she remained quiet. Luke didn't push her to speak. He knew that trust could not be forced. By nightfall, the stars sparkled above the canyon, each one bright against the dark sky. Luke and Aita sat near the fire, the silence between them no longer tense but filled with cautious understanding. Luke thought about how many times he had faced danger alone, and yet he had never felt such a sense of responsibility. He knew that the woman's life now rested in his hands, and he vowed silently that he would do everything possible to keep her safe. Sleep came slowly that night, and Luke kept watch while Aita rested. Every rustle of wind through the canyon, every distant animal cry made him alert. He knew that danger could appear at any moment, from wild animals or from humans who would not understand his actions. But he did not waver. He had found her when she was at her lowest, and he would not abandon her. As dawn approached, the first light of the sun revealed the harsh beauty of the desert in a new way. Luke looked at Aita, now sleeping more peacefully, and felt a quiet determination settle over him. This was only the beginning. The desert was vast, dangerous, and unforgiving, but he had a purpose now, protecting her, guiding her, and earning her trust. The encounter that had begun as a chance meeting had become a turning point in both their lives. Luke had come across many people in his years, some friends, some enemies, but none who had stirred such a sense of duty and compassion within him. Aita, though weak and frightened, had shown a resilience that impressed him deeply. And as he watched her sleep, he promised himself that he would see her through this trial, no matter what lay ahead. The first part of their story had ended with the sun rising over the desert, bathing the world in gold and hope. For Luke, the desert had always been a place of survival and solitude, but now it was a place of responsibility, compassion, and the start of a bond that neither of them could yet fully understand. The journey ahead would be difficult, but in that moment, Luke knew one thing clearly. It would not leave her to face the world alone. Luke woke early that morning, the first light of dawn spilling over the desert rocks and illuminating the canyon in soft golden hues. Aita was still asleep, her thin body curled beneath his coat, her small chest rising and falling with each quiet breath. Luke watched her for a moment, noticing how fragile she looked, yet sensing a quiet strength within her. He knew that to help her, he would have to move carefully, earning her trust step by step. It would not be enough to provide food and water. She needed reassurance, protection, and patience. He took care not to wake her as he prepared breakfast. Using the few supplies he carried, he warmed some water and roasted a small portion of dried meat over the fire. He remembered how important nourishment would be for her body to recover from days of neglect and starvation. As he worked, Luke thought about the long journey ahead. The desert was full of dangers, wild animals, harsh weather, and at times men who saw weakness as an opportunity to exploit it. But he had made a promise to himself the night before. He would not abandon Aita, no matter what. When Aita finally stirred, she blinked at the sunlight, her dark eyes adjusting slowly. Luke spoke softly, keeping his tone calm and friendly. "Morning," he said. "I made some food. You should eat a little. It'll give you strength." At first she hesitated, her gaze wary. The memory of being taken and left to suffer still haunted her. But hunger and the kindness in Luke's eyes overcame her fear. She reached out, taking the warm bread and small pieces of meat. Luke watched as she ate slowly, savoring each bite. Once she had eaten, Luke handed her a canteen of water. "Drink carefully," he instructed. She nodded, holding the canteen with both hands and taking small sips. Luke noticed the way she looked at him, not with fear this time, but with a cautious curiosity. Slowly, a small bond was forming between them, fragile but real. He knew he had to build on that trust with his actions, not just words.
After breakfast, Luke suggested they move to a safer location where they could rest and plan their next steps.
Aita's legs were weak, so he supported her as they walked, his arm around her shoulders. The sun was now higher in the sky, and the desert heat made every step difficult. Luke guided her carefully, choosing paths that offered some shade and avoiding the open spaces where they might be seen by strangers. Along the way, Luke kept talking, sharing small stories about his life as a cowboy, about the times he had faced danger and survived. He spoke about the cattle drives, the storms he had endured, and the quiet nights by the campfire. Aita listened in silence at first, absorbing his words without interrupting. Then, cautiously, she began to ask questions, curious about the man who had saved her life. Luke answered honestly, not embellishing or hiding the truth of the harsh world they lived in. He wanted her to understand that he was not just a stranger, but someone who had faced hardship and could help her navigate it. By midday, they reached a small cluster of rocks that formed a natural shelter. Luke laid out some blankets and helped Aida sit down. He examined her carefully, noticing bruises and scratches on her arms and legs. Using clean water and cloth, he gently cleaned her wounds, explaining each step to help her relax. Aida flinched when he touched a particularly tender spot, but she did not pull away. Slowly, she began to trust his hands, realizing that he meant no harm. Once her wounds were cleaned, Luke began to repair her torn clothing as best he could. He used strips of cloth and careful stitching to make her clothes wearable again. It was a slow process, and Aida watched quietly, sometimes offering small suggestions. The act of helping her with clothing was more than practical. It was a way to restore a sense of dignity that had been stripped from her. Luke knew that survival in the desert was not just about food and water, but also about maintaining hope and humanity. As the afternoon wore on, Luke and Aida settled into a routine. He hunted small game nearby, catching rabbits and birds to provide fresh food. He gathered water from a hidden spring, careful to leave no trace for anyone who might be tracking them. Aita, though still weak, began to help in small ways, carrying water or arranging the firewood. Every task she performed, no matter how small, gave her a sense of control over her life again. Luke encouraged her gently, praising her efforts and reinforcing that she was capable and strong. During quiet moments, Luke spoke to Aita about the desert, teaching her how to read tracks, find edible plants, and identify safe water sources. She listened attentively, asking questions when she did not understand. He also taught her how to recognize danger, the signs of predators, unstable cliffs, and the approach of strangers. Slowly, she began to understand the environment that had once seemed so hostile. The desert was no longer just a place of fear. It became a land of knowledge, guided by Luke's careful mentorship. As evening approached, Luke prepared a small fire and set out the food he had caught. Aita sat nearby, her body much stronger now, though still cautious. They ate together in silence, the quiet only broken by the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of desert birds. Luke felt a deep satisfaction in seeing her begin to recover, not just physically but mentally and emotionally. The fear that had once dominated her eyes was giving way to a flicker of hope. Night fell, and the desert transformed under the light of the stars. Luke kept the fire small but bright enough to provide warmth and comfort. He kept a careful watch while Aita rested, ensuring no danger could approach undetected. She had begun to sleep more peacefully, the tension in her body slowly melting away. Luke knew that trust was fragile, and he was determined to protect it. Before closing his eyes, Luke spoke softly to Aita, who was sitting quietly by the fire. "You're safe here," he said, No one will hurt you while I'm around. She looked up at him, and for the first time her eyes reflected not fear, but a tentative gratitude. Luke knew that words alone were not enough, but they were a start. His promise was simple, yet profound. He would not abandon her, no matter the challenges ahead. As the night deepened, Luke reflected on the events of the day. The desert had tested them both, but it had also given them a chance to find each other. He understood that this was only the beginning of a long journey, one that would require patience, courage, and compassion. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Protecting Aita was no longer just an obligation. It was a responsibility he had chosen willingly, and one he would honor with every step he took in the harsh, beautiful desert. By the time dawn approached again, Aita's breathing was steady, her body stronger, and her spirit quieter, though still cautious. Luke watched over her with a quiet pride, knowing that their bond was growing. Slowly but surely. He did not know what challenges awaited them, but he felt confident that together they could face whatever the desert threw at them. The day ended with the soft light of stars reflecting off the rocks, a gentle reminder that even in the harshest places hope could endure. Luke and Aida had survived another day, and with every passing moment the seeds of trust and companionship were taking root. They were no longer just a cowboy and a frightened woman. They were allies, linked by circumstance and courage, beginning a journey that would change both of their lives forever. The sun rose slowly over the desert, painting the rocks in shades of gold and pink. Luke had been awake for some time, keeping watch over Aita as she slept. Her breathing was steady now, her face more relaxed than it had been when he first found her. Even in sleep she looked fragile, yet there was a quiet strength emerging in her posture. Luke quietly stood, brushing the dust from his coat, and scanned the horizon. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, full of hidden dangers, but also of life and quiet beauty.
Aida stirred as the first rays of sunlight touched her face.
She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the brightness, and looked around as if trying to remember where she was. When her gaze met Luke's, she felt a small reassurance she had not felt in days, perhaps weeks. Luke smiled faintly, keeping his tone calm and friendly. "Morning, Aita," he said. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I think so," she said. Her accent and tone were unfamiliar to him, but he had begun to recognize the subtle inflections of her language. Luke offered her some water and a small portion of the food he had prepared. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted it. Luke watched her carefully as she ate, making sure she did not eat too quickly or too little. It was a delicate balance, rebuilding her strength without overwhelming her body. As she finished, Luke began to speak, not just to give her instructions or guidance, but to slowly open a bridge between them. "You're stronger than you think," he said.
I can see it already. You've been through a lot, but you're still here. Aita looked down, shy and unsure how to respond.
The words were unfamiliar in their kindness. She had not heard such encouragement in a long time. Slowly, a small smile touched her lips, tentative and cautious, but it was there. The morning passed quietly as Luke showed Aida simple tasks to help her regain some independence. He taught her how to gather firewood without overexerting herself, how to identify safe plants along the canyon, and how to find small pockets of water hidden in rocks. At first, she struggled, unsure of her own strength after days of weakness and hunger. But Luke was patient, demonstrating each step carefully, never rushing her, never showing frustration. "You're doing well," he said, his voice calm but firm, little by little. "Don't worry if it's slow. That's how you learn." Aida nodded, absorbing his words like water soaking into dry soil. She began to try tasks on her own, fumbling at first, but gradually improving. Luke noticed the spark of determination in her eyes, the subtle way she straightened her back and lifted her chin with pride after completing even the smallest task. By midday, the sun was high and the desert heat pressed down upon them. Luke suggested they rest in the shade of a large rock outcropping. Aita leaned against the stone, her breathing steady, and Luke sat beside her. For a long while they were silent, listening to the wind whisper through the canyon and the distant cries of desert birds. There was no need for words. The shared quiet brought a sense of calm and understanding between them. Finally, Aita spoke. Her voice was soft, hesitant, as if testing the waters of conversation. Why did you help me?" she asked. Luke paused, considering his answer. He knew she had been hurt and abandoned before, and she would not trust empty words. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "No one should be left to die when they don't have to. And because I know what it feels like to be alone." She looked at him then. Really looked, and something in her expression shifted. There was a flicker of recognition, a sense that this man understood hardship in a way she did not yet fully trust, but respected. She did not answer immediately, only nodded slightly, as if acknowledging his words without committing to full trust. Luke understood this. It would take time. Trust, once broken, was never rebuilt in a single day. The afternoon brought another task. Luke had noticed tracks of wild animals nearby and decided to teach Aida how to recognize them. He crouched low, pointing to footprints in the dusty ground. "See these?" he asked. "These are rabbit tracks. They're fresh. If we follow them carefully, we might find food."
Aita leaned forward, her eyes intent, and followed his instructions.
Step by step, she mimicked his movements, careful not to disturb the tracks. Luke watched silently, feeling a quiet pride in her progress. As they moved through the desert, he began to share small stories of his life. He spoke of long nights on the prairie, of storms that threatened to destroy everything, and of moments when he had thought he might not survive. Each story was chosen carefully, not to frighten her, but to teach her resilience, courage, and the value of careful observation. Aita listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions. Each answer strengthened the bond between them, bridging the gap of fear and suspicion that had existed since the day he found her. When they returned to their shelter later, Luke taught Aida a simple way to purify water using sand and cloth, explaining every step patiently. She followed his instructions carefully, her hands now steady and confident. The look of accomplishment on her face made Luke smile. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, and it meant more than any battle he had fought in his life. That evening, Luke prepared a modest meal while Aida rested. She watched him work, her eyes reflecting curiosity and a growing sense of security. For the first time, she felt as if someone truly cared about her well-being. Not for their own gain, but simply because it was right. She realized that Luke's protection was not just physical but also emotional. It gave her the courage to let her guard down even slightly in a world where trust had been a luxury she could not afford. After dinner, they sat by the fire, the desert night cool and quiet around them. Luke told a story about a time he had been lost in a storm, the wind howling, rain lashing against his face. He had feared for his life, but through careful observation and patience, he had found his way to safety. Aita listened closely, her fear of the unknown slowly being replaced with understanding. She realized that she could learn to survive, and that she did not have to face the world alone anymore. The night grew colder, and Luke handed Aita his coat to keep her warm. She hesitated for a moment, then accepted it, feeling the warmth and protection it offered. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. She began to see Luke not just as a stranger who had saved her, but as a man she could trust, someone who had chosen to care for her without expectation. Before sleeping, Luke spoke softly, almost to himself.
"We'll get through this, Aida. I promise."
She looked at him, and for the first time she felt the stirrings of hope. It was not complete trust, not yet, but it was the beginning, a fragile thread connecting two lives in the vast desert, growing stronger with every shared moment, every lesson, and every act of kindness. Throughout the night, Luke kept watch, listening to the sounds of the desert, his eyes alert for danger. Aita slept more peacefully than ever, the tension in her body easing as the protective presence of Luke reassured her. He understood that trust was fragile, but he was willing to be patient. He had saved her once, and he would continue to protect her, teaching her, guiding her, and helping her rediscover her strength. As the first light of dawn touched the canyon walls, Luke looked at Aita sleeping under his coat and felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The day had been long and challenging, but they had survived it together. Their bond had grown imperceptibly, perhaps, but surely. Aita had begun to trust him, to believe that not all men were cruel, and that kindness and protection were possible, even in a harsh, unforgiving world. For Luke, the journey ahead was still uncertain. The desert held many dangers, and they would face challenges that neither of them could yet imagine. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not leave her side. Their connection was no longer just circumstance, it was a commitment, a quiet understanding that they would face whatever came next together. As the morning sun rose higher, Luke prepared to teach Aita new skills for survival, knowing that each lesson, each shared experience, was a step toward building trust, courage, and hope. Together they were learning not just to survive, but to live again. The bond between them, fragile and new, was growing stronger, and with it came the promise of a journey filled with resilience, friendship, and the quiet power of human kindness. The desert sun beat down mercilessly that morning, the heat rising off the sand and rocks in shimmering waves. Luke and Aita had made their way to a small canyon, where the rocks created natural shade and offered some protection from prying eyes. Though Aita had regained much of her strength, Luke remained vigilant. He knew the desert was never truly safe, and dangers lurked not only in nature but among men who might see her as an object of exploitation or profit. He could not afford to let his guard down. Not for a moment. As they settled down near a cluster of rocks, Luke taught Aita more advanced skills to survive the desert. He showed her how to read the tracks of animals, identifying which creatures were nearby and which could be dangerous. He explained how to follow trails without leaving their own tracks, and how to detect subtle changes in the wind that might carry the scent of strangers. Aita listened carefully, mimicking his movements, and her hands were now steady and sure. She had grown more confident in the days since he found her, but Luke could see the caution still lingering in her eyes. While demonstrating how to climb a steep rock to get a better view of the surrounding desert, Luke paused. "Always check your surroundings," he said, squinting against the glare of the sun. "A wrong step or a careless glance can cost you." Aita nodded, following his advice, and together they climbed to a small plateau overlooking the canyon floor. From there, they could see the winding paths and sparse vegetation stretching for miles. The vantage point allowed them to spot danger early, whether it was wild animals or other people moving in the distance. Suddenly, Luke's sharp eyes caught movement far below. A small group of men, riding horses, were approaching the canyon trail. Luke's hand went to his side, near his rifle, and he lowered his voice. "Stay close, Aita," he whispered. "We might have company." Her heart raced, and though she tried to hide it, Luke could see her tension. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm here. You're safe with me. Just follow my lead." She nodded, gripping the edge of his coat. The men below were armed, and though they had not noticed Luke and Aita yet, it was clear they were looking for someone. Luke crouched behind a rock, signaling Aita to do the same. He observed their movements carefully. The men seemed rough, their horses kicking up dust as they rode along the trail. Luke counted them, 4 riders, and calculated their distance, the wind direction, and how long it would take for them to reach the canyon where they were hiding. Aita's breathing was quick, but she remained silent, trusting Luke's guidance. He whispered instructions to her, showing her how to stay low and make herself small. "Don't move," he said. "Stay behind the rock and let me handle this. You just follow my lead." She nodded, her hands clutching a small piece of cloth for comfort. She realized that her survival now depended not only on her own skills, but also on trusting Luke completely. As the men drew closer, Luke began to prepare for any confrontation. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was ready, and considered the best way to protect both of them without escalating the situation unnecessarily. He did not want to fight unless it was unavoidable. He had learned long ago that caution often worked better than aggression. Yet he also knew that these men could be dangerous, and that Aita's safety was paramount. The riders slowed as they reached the base of the canyon. Luke held his breath, keeping his position hidden behind the rocks. The men scanned the area, talking among themselves. "She has to be around here somewhere," one of them said. Luke listened carefully, noting the words and the tone of their voices. They were looking for someone specific, and though they did not recognize Luke or Aita, they might become suspicious if they lingered too long. Luke whispered to Aita, "We're going to wait until they move past. Don't make a sound." She nodded, biting her lip to keep from trembling. The men paused, then continued along the trail, seemingly unaware of their presence. Luke stayed crouched, counting the seconds, until the riders were out of sight. Only then did he allow himself a quiet breath of relief. "That was close," he said softly. Aida's hands were shaking slightly, but she managed a small nod. I was scared," she admitted quietly. Luke looked at her with understanding. "Of course you were, but you did exactly what I told you." "You stayed calm, and that's what kept us safe." She smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time, she realized that her fear could be managed, and that she was not helpless when she followed Luke's guidance. The rest of the day was spent moving cautiously through the canyon. Luke taught Aida more survival techniques, how to find edible plants, how to identify signs of predators, and how to listen to subtle sounds that might indicate danger. They took turns keeping watch, and Luke encouraged Aida to speak up if she noticed anything unusual. The more she practiced, the more confident she became, and Luke could see her growing stronger not only in body but in spirit. By late afternoon, they found a small stream with clear, cool water. Luke allowed Aida to drink and wash her face, encouraging her to relax for a moment.
"You're doing well," he said.
"Look at you. You've come a long way in just a few days." Aida smiled, a real, unguarded smile this time, and she felt a sense of pride she had not experienced in a long time. It was the first time she truly felt she could survive, not just endure.
As they rested near the stream, Luke kept his watchful eye on the canyon.
"There are dangers we can't always see," he explained, "but we can be ready for them. That's what makes the difference." Aita listened carefully, realizing that his knowledge and experience were invaluable. She began to understand that survival was not just about strength, but about awareness, patience, and careful decision-making. Luke's guidance was teaching her skills she had never imagined she could learn. Evening approached, and the canyon grew cooler. Luke built a small fire, careful not to make it too bright or smoke too heavily. Aida helped gather kindling, her movements sure and precise. The act of working together in silence strengthened their bond, creating a rhythm of trust and cooperation. As they ate a simple meal of roasted meat and bread, Aida felt a sense of safety she had not known for months. Luke's presence was a shield against the dangers of the desert, and she began to realize that she could rely on him, not just for protection, but for guidance and companionship. As night fell, the desert became alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. Luke kept a careful watch while Aida rested. He shared stories of his experiences in the desert at night, the animals that hunted in darkness, the changes in wind and temperature that could signal danger, and the quiet beauty of a sky filled with stars. Aida listened closely, absorbing every detail, learning not only to survive but to appreciate the world around her. Later that night, Luke spoke softly, his voice almost a whisper. "No one can hurt you while I'm here," he said. Aida looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight and a growing trust. She felt a warmth in her chest, a sense of relief she had not known since being captured. Luke's words were not just empty promises, they carried the weight of experience, commitment, and care. She began to feel that she could depend on him completely. As they settled to sleep, Luke kept watch over Aida, alert to every sound. The desert was unpredictable, and he knew that even a moment of carelessness could bring danger. But as he watched her sleep peacefully under his coat, he felt a quiet satisfaction. They had survived another day, faced the threat of strangers, and grown stronger together. The bond between them, forged in hardship and trust, was growing deeper with each passing moment. By the first light of dawn, Aida's eyes opened slowly, She stretched and looked at Luke, feeling a newfound courage. The dangers of the desert had not disappeared, but she had learned that with Luke's guidance she could face them. She no longer felt helpless. Instead, she felt prepared, aware, and most importantly, safe. Luke watched her, knowing that the trust they had built was fragile, but real. They had faced danger together and come through unscathed, and with each challenge, their connection strengthened. The desert was still vast and unpredictable, but together, they were learning to navigate it. The day ended with a quiet understanding between them, that they would face the unknown together, relying on each other's strength and skills. Luke's protection and Aita's growing confidence created a bond that could withstand the harshness of the frontier. For the first time, both of them felt a sense of hope that had been missing for so long, a hope that tomorrow and the days beyond would bring safety, growth, and trust. The sun rose gently over the desert horizon, painting the rocks and sand in shades of gold and pink. Luke and Aita had traveled carefully through the canyon for several days, always alert, always moving cautiously. Yet, as they approached a distant settlement, the tension in their bodies began to ease. For the first time, they could see a place where they might rest safely, where Aita could recover fully, and where they could both plan for the days ahead. The settlement was small but well kept, a cluster of wooden buildings with a few fences and gardens, signs of life and stability in a harsh landscape. Children ran along the dirt paths and farmers tended to their fields. Luke guided Aita toward the outskirts, keeping her close, ensuring no one could harm her. She walked beside him, her steps steady and confident now. Her strength had returned, but it was more than physical. She carried herself with dignity, awareness, and a quiet courage that had grown with every lesson Luke had taught her. As they entered the settlement, Luke spoke to her quietly. "This is a safe place. People here won't hurt you. You can rest, eat, and be yourself without fear." Aita nodded, glancing around with cautious curiosity. The noises of the settlement, the chatter of people, the clatter of tools, the laughter of children, were foreign to her, yet strangely comforting. For so long she had known only fear and danger. Now she could see a life beyond survival, a life where she could be free. Luke found a kind man named Thomas, a settler he had known from his travels, and explained the situation. "She needs a safe place to stay. She's been through a lot," he said. Thomas nodded, understanding immediately. "Bring her to the cabin over there. You'll both be safe," he replied. Luke guided Aita to the cabin, helping her through the door and settling her on a small bed. She looked around the simple room, feeling warmth, comfort, and a sense of security she had not felt in months. Over the next few days, Aita slowly adjusted to life in the settlement. She ate meals regularly, her body regaining strength with each passing day. Luke taught her how to do small chores, like fetching water, tending a garden, and caring for animals. At first, she was hesitant, unsure of her place in this new world, but Luke encouraged her gently, praising her efforts and reminding her of her resilience. Each task she completed, no matter how small, gave her a sense of accomplishment and confidence. During this time, their bond deepened. Luke did not force conversation, but they shared quiet moments, laughter, and small stories of the past. Aita began to speak of her family and her home, memories that had once brought only pain now tempered by the safety and trust Luke had provided. He listened carefully, offering comfort without judgment, allowing her to process her emotions at her own pace. The more she shared, the lighter her spirit became, and the more she understood that Luke's protection was more than physical. It was a constant presence, a promise that someone cared deeply about her well-being. One afternoon, Luke took Aita to the edge of the settlement, where a gentle river flowed. He taught her how to fish and how to identify edible plants along the banks. She laughed for the first time in weeks, the sound clear and bright against the soft rush of the water. Luke smiled, feeling a sense of pride and relief. The girl who had once been frightened, weak, and wary was now strong, capable, and beginning to trust in a world that had once only brought pain. As the days turned into weeks, Aita's confidence grew further. She began to interact with the settlers, learning their language more fluently and understanding their customs. She tended the small garden beside Thomas's cabin and helped care for the animals. Luke remained nearby, watching and guiding when needed, but also giving her the space to grow independently. He knew that protection was not only about standing between her and danger. It was also about empowering her to face the world on her own terms. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and purple, Luke and Aita sat by the river, watching the water sparkle in the fading light. "You've done well," Luke said quietly. "Look at you now. You're strong, capable, and safe. I'm proud of you." Aita looked at him, her eyes reflecting gratitude and something deeper, a sense of belonging she had never known. I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly. Luke shook his head, smiling gently. "No, Aita."
You did this. I only helped you see that you could.
"You've always had the strength inside you. The settlement's safety allowed them to plan for the future." Luke taught Aita about navigation, basic self-defense, and practical survival skills in case they ever needed them again. She listened attentively, eager to learn, not out of fear, but out of a desire to be prepared and independent. Luke also shared more of his life story, his travels, his hardships, and the lessons he had learned along the way. These shared experiences created a foundation of trust, respect, and mutual understanding that could not be broken. As time passed, the bond between Luke and Aita became more than just one of protection and survival. It grew into a deep friendship, rooted in shared experiences, trust, and mutual care. Aita began to smile more often, her laughter returning to her life, and her eyes no longer carried the constant shadow of fear. She began to dream of the future, a life where she could thrive, learn, and perhaps even help others who had faced similar hardships. Luke, too, felt a sense of fulfillment he had not known for many years. He had wandered the desert for so long, guided by survival and routine, yet he had never felt a purpose as profound as helping Aita rebuild her life. Protecting her had transformed him as well. He had learned patience, empathy, and the quiet power of kindness in a world that often rewarded cruelty. One day, Aita approached Luke with a small gift, a woven bracelet made from threads she had collected. "For you," she said, holding it out shyly. Luke accepted it, touched by the gesture. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll wear it as a reminder of how far you've come." Aita smiled, a mixture of pride and happiness in her expression. It was a small token, but it symbolized the bond they had built, a bond of trust, protection, and genuine care. Life in the settlement continued peacefully. Aita integrated fully into the community, helping with daily chores, learning from others, and sharing her own knowledge of the land and survival. She no longer felt like a prisoner of circumstance. Instead, she was a young woman with hope, strength, and a sense of belonging. Luke remained by her side, not as a constant shadow, but as a steady presence, offering guidance and protection when needed, and sharing in the joys of her growth and recovery. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Aita and Luke stood at the edge of the settlement, looking out over the desert that had once been a place of fear and danger. "The world is different now," Aita said softly. "I used to feel trapped, alone, but now I feel free." Luke nodded, feeling a swell of pride and relief.
Yes, Aita.
"And you've earned it. Every step, every lesson, every challenge, you've faced them all. And you're stronger because of it." For Luke, the desert was no longer just a place of solitude and hardship. It had become a place of growth, compassion, and connection. He had come across many people in his life, but none had left such an impression as Aita. She had shown resilience, courage, and a willingness to trust again, despite the pain and fear she had endured. And in return, Luke had shown that kindness, protection, and understanding could still exist in a harsh and unforgiving world. As the stars appeared in the night sky, twinkling above the settlement, Aita felt a deep sense of peace. She had survived, grown, and learned to trust again. Luke stood beside her, his presence a steady reassurance, a reminder that she was never alone. Together they had faced the desert, danger, and uncertainty, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to embrace the future. In that quiet moment, the bond between them was undeniable. It was a bond forged in the harshness of the desert, strengthened through shared hardship and mutual respect, and solidified by trust and care. Aita had found safety, hope, and friendship, and Luke had found purpose, pride, and a renewed faith in the goodness of people. The journey that had begun with fear and uncertainty had transformed into one of healing, resilience, and a new beginning. The desert, once a symbol of danger and despair, had become a witness to their growth and triumph. And as they stood together looking out over the land, they knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them side by side, united by the trust and care they had built in the most unlikely of circumstances. Life had changed for both of them, and in that change they had discovered something far more valuable than survival alone. They had discovered hope, strength, and the enduring power of human kindness.